Part of what makes Dickinson such a touchstone poet of her time is the fact that her poetry about such a dark yet common subject as death is largely experimental. Brandy Ryan of West Virginia University argues that 19th century women poets felt disenfranchised by the elegiac form, as only men were really taken seriously when writing poetry about such somber topics as death. Which we can easily see here in Ryan's essay, where she says that women imitate the desire to reform a genre that has excluded them. The genre, of course, that she's speaking of is the elegiac space, which women have been disenfranchised from. They don't have any inheritance or access to this space. Dickinson, however, through her experimentation with the subject, creates a space where women poets, especially herself, are able to experiment with the elegy, since she writes poems about death that mimic the basic form of a joke. She treats death as something to be desired, and she even bends the expectations of the imagery of traditional Christian afterlife. First, we can examine how some of Emily Dickinson's poems about death follow the traditional joke scheme. When we say that Dickinson jokes about death, we do not necessarily mean that she makes us fall out of our seats laughing, or even that she makes us lightly chuckle. What we mean is that she subverts our expectations, intentionally misleads us. Let's examine the classic joke scheme provided by Kathleen Holley's article from American Humor Journal. In this figure, we see that a joke occurs when the ongoing expectations of the audience is disrupted by a new level of discourse. A is the original discourse. The audience expects that the author will continue to talk about A, but instead the discourse takes a turn at X, the punchline, so to say, and continues with B, the new level of discourse. A then becomes a dotted line as our ongoing expectations have been sliced. Let's examine how Dickinson's poem, Dying in the Night, follows this classic joke scheme. The first two stanzas introduce the typical joke line A, where she is clearly talking about dying in the darkness of the nighttime. She says, dying in the night. Won't somebody bring the light so I can see which way to go? Into the everlasting snow. And Jesus, where is Jesus gone? They said that Jesus always came. Perhaps he doesn't know the house. This way, Jesus, let him pass. Clearly, in these two stanzas, Dickinson's original line of discourse talks about someone's soul leaving their body, on its way into the everlasting snow that is heaven. The soul worries that Jesus will not be able to find her. Where X, or the figure that displaces the original discourse, is introduced, is in the third stanza. The figure that is Dolly is the displacement. When Dolly is introduced, our expectation that Dickinson will continue speaking about her dying soul's search for Jesus is then disrupted, as B, or the new level of discourse that is introduced, focuses solely on an entirely different subject, Dolly. She says, somebody run to the great gate, and see if Dolly's coming. Wait, I hear her foot upon the stair. Death won't hurt, now Dolly's here. The joke, again, need not necessarily be funny by modern standards. It simply needs to subvert audience expectations. What Dickinson has done here is experiment with the somber mood of most elegies by completely changing the mood at the end. Death won't hurt now, Dolly's here. She displaces the solemn original line of discourse and instead leaves us with a feeling of hope, of euphoria. Not only does Dickinson experiment with the elegiac form by playing around with it, she also creates an attitude toward the act of dying as something to be desired, and something that seems almost sacrilegious. ignoring the typical reverence to the Christian afterlife. We must shift our focus toward this Dolly figure at the end of the poem. We can see in this letter addressed to Dolly the use of this affectionate nickname. The letter poem, as such a piece was called by Dickinson scholar Martha Nell Smith, begins, "Excuse me, Dolly." Upon examining this letter poem's publication history, it's revealed that the recipient, or Dolly, is none other than Susan Dickinson, Emily's sister-in-law, with whom she had a very close relationship. In the essay, "Wasn't She a Lesbian?" by Kristen M. Comment, we can see that the aforementioned Martha Nell Smith, in her book Rowing in Eden, Rereading Emily Dickinson, argues that the most fitting way to describe the relationship between Dickinson and Susan is as lesbian partners, as Dickinson's letters to Susan frequently reference the desire to engage with her both sexually and romantically. Now, if we reread the third stanza, we can see that Dickinson turns the act of dying into something almost sacrilegious. Jesus, the all-powerful Christian figurehead who is meant to greet us at the great gate, mentioned in the final stanza, is replaced by Dolly. In fact, Dolly, or Susan, is seen as a more desirable doorman than Jesus Christ himself. "Somebody run to the great gate and see if Dolly's coming. Wait, I hear her feet upon the stair. Death won't hurt, now Dolly's here." Dickinson has just replaced her same-sex lover as a more desirable figure to walk with her to heaven than Jesus Christ himself. Thus, she has certainly subverted typical male attitudes toward death that are commonly reflected in elegiac poetry. She's transformed it into something almost euphorically sapphic. It's clear that men aren't necessarily needed here, even if that man is Jesus Christ himself. The fact that Dickinson wrote within a genre of poetry that egregiously excluded people of her gender in the first place is no small feat. But going even one step further, being unafraid to experiment within the genre, subverting the typical male-centric norms surrounding it to fit her own idea of death, she transforms the elegiac form into something that is uniquely hers, and becomes an inspiration to women poets wanting to break ground in a hegemonically male sphere. She creates a space to write about death that is not only uniquely hers, but entirely female, completely subverting the habitus surrounding the male elegiac genre. She proves to us that poetry written by women about more somber subjects such as death should be published.